Okay, so thanks very much for having me along today. It's been great to hear all the talks so far. What I'm going to talk about today has already been mentioned a couple of times by Hamish and Duncan earlier on, but it's some work that I've been involved with many other colleagues at the university and more widely, looking at the potential to grow fruit and veg in our cities and towns. And I've been operating at a national scale, and then also down at city scales. But the key for me to understanding how much food we are currently growing and how much food we could be growing is really understanding some basic questions first. And that's what I've been working on over the last couple of years. And the first question is, what food do people want to grow? What food are we interested in growing as a population in the UK? And to understand that, we've been working across the UK, mapping areas of land that household growers in allotments use for growing different food crops. So it's almost looking at the different crops that we value and the amounts of space that we want to use for growing those crops. But then also when we're thinking about growing fruit and veg, we need to understand yield. Now, we've got a really good understanding of yields in commercial systems, but as Fran showed you earlier and talked about earlier, the way we grow ourselves in allotments, in gardens, in community gardens looks very, very different to growing in commercial horticultural settings. So we'd assume that the yields are very different. And so really, when we start to think about understanding potential to grow food and current food production, we need to understand crop yields as well. And that those are crop yields achieved by people across the UK growing in different spaces at different scales, from a very small container all the way up to a big allotment. And so I set up a project called Measure Your Harvest, and I've missed a trick here because I could have been plugging it on the slide. It's myharvest.org.uk. It's a project, citizen science project that's been running now. It's going into its 5th growing season, looking at yields achieved by own growers for one crop, so just the spuds, or all the crops that they grow. And that evidence that we collect from those data is really crucial for us to be able to then say, well, okay, we know that allotments cover this much land, but how much food are people growing? And that's a combination of both that crop yield and the areas of land people use for growing food. And so that work that's been ongoing and has been at a national scale underlies the work I'm going to talk to you about now, which looked within Sheffield, because it's our city, it's the place that I understood the best, looked at what's being grown now and how we might improve and increase local food production. So this is a theoretical thing. We used computer-based modelling to look at the area, and really high spatial resolution data sets to look at the areas of land that might be used for growing food. But first of all, we thought, well, how much of the city is an allotment? Because that's the area of land we know at the moment that householders are using to grow food. And we found that about 1.5% of the city's green space was allotment. It declined massively from a peak in the 1950s. And that's some work we've also done nationally, looking at changes in food provision over time. But even though the allotments covered a relatively small area of land, they were feeding about 3% of the population on their 5-a-day diet, based on that yield estimate and that understanding of the different crops that people were growing. And you can, if you look at the map beneath the soil-based horticulture text, you can pick out in Sheffield the allotments, and you can pick out, I think, particularly the Mearsbrook site that's really big. It's the light blue colour. So they don't make up much of the city, but they're feeding potentially on the 5-a-day diet. But after we'd established that, we then thought about, well, we know that green space actually makes up quite a lot of our cities. You might walk around and see roads and buildings, but those green spaces are interwoven across our cities. And so how might we start to use that green space for growing food? And again, we use this kind of high spatial resolution data sets in a computer to look at areas of land that we could use for growing food. So we knocked out all of we knew where all the trees were, because we had a layer that told us where all the trees are. So we knocked out all of that from our potential areas for growing food, and we knocked out the key sports pitches and things like that. We didn't discount things like urban parks, grassland in urban parks. That's not to say we should use all of that city to grow food, or all of that grassland to grow food in those parks, but maybe we should start thinking about some of that green space. But when we looked at the area of land that was available, it was quite startling, and Hamish mentioned this earlier, but we found that there were 98 square metres of land per person for growing food in the city. Now, a big part of that was gardens. And gardens are something that are really interesting in that individuals, households can go out and change the way they manage that green space, but they're not distributed equally across the city for people. Some people have gardens, some people don't. But despite that, just thinking about that land resource is an important bit of context. So 98 square metres of land per person in the city. In the UK, we grow just over 50% of the veg we eat, just over half of, just under 20% of the fruit that we eat in a really small area of land. So there's about 23 square metres of land used in commercial horticulture for growing fruit and veg in the UK at the moment. 4 times that potentially available in Sheffield. So that gives you that context, and that land could potentially feed more than the population of the city on their 5-a-day diet. I'm not advocating that we should move all of our green space into food production, but how about thinking about transforming, say, 10% of it? What would that get us? So if we use just 10% of that green space in gardens and in sort of the other bits of green space across the city for growing fruit and veg, we estimate you could feed about 15% of the population. Now, if you start to think about the fact that the UK is about 84% urban, the population, and so our urban areas typically have about 50% green space, then you really do start to see that not only could we start to produce food and make a big contribution to local food production within our green spaces in our cities and towns, but we could also start contributing to our national resilience by producing a lot of our food locally, particularly when we've got unsustainable production of fruit and veg in places like the Fenland systems, where we're losing things like a centimetre of soil every year for growing our food crops. The other thing that we have in our cities, I've talked about green spaces, but we have a lot of buildings, and quite a lot of them are flat roofed. And they really do provide potential, particularly in the future, to grow fruit and veg in a controlled environment. So that could be an aquaponic system or a hydroponic system. And I'm not really going to dwell on this because it's been spoken about before, but if you think about a complementary system where we're growing in both green and grey spaces, you start to really think about how things could be scaled up. And the image that you can see in the middle of the screen is just taken from the very city centre of Sheffield. And it shows that there's potential to start to grow high value, high yielding crops year round within the city centre. But there are serious challenges that we have to overcome before we can start to transform this food system, before we can start to integrate production. And again, Duncan showed this conceptual diagram in the top right of the slide to you earlier. I'm not expecting you to be able to look at it, you certainly can't. But what we thought about here is what are the barriers preventing expansion of urban horticulture? And what it comes down to are key things. There's a scientific barriers. So things like, how can we grow things in different places? Are there challenges related to soil pollution? There are sociocultural barriers. So things like, what is preventing people from participating in growing food? There's knowledge. So as a society, we're pretty disconnected from food production, aren't we? And we've forgotten the skills. And then there are practical challenges. So, if we want to put a hydroponic system or an aquaponic system on top of a building, we need to check that it's not going to collapse. So I'm going to leave that there and just talk very briefly about the work that I'm doing now with both colleagues at Sheffield University, so Sam Caton in School of Health and Related Research and Paul Norman in Psychology, but also with the Sheffield City Council and Barnsley Metropolitan Council, with people at Food Hall, and with Fran Halsall and Gareth and others looking at how at a case study level, if we do start to engage people with growing food, if we are starting to get people involved that have never grown before, potentially in growing food in community gardens or in gardens, how do we motivate them to do that? What are the perceived barriers to growing food, and how do we motivate people to participate?
Apologies, Joe, just time.
Time up. Shall I stop?
Just a round up.
Okay, cool. I've pretty much finished anyway. If we do start to grow food, what are the impacts on people's health and well-being and on the wider environment? And how can we then integrate this kind of supply of hyperlocal produce safely into supply chains? And I'll stop there. Thank you.